Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to be here to rise and join the debate today. I would like to inform you I'll be sharing my time with the excellent Member of Parliament from Red Deer Lacombe, who I look forward to his speech greatly. Now, I'm from British Columbia, where we've had Canada's first true carbon tax that has now been in use for a decade. At the time, the BC carbon tax was proposed to be revenue neutral. Now, taxes raised from a carbon tax would be used to lower other taxes, such as BC's personal, small business, and corporate tax rates. And indeed, for much of the last decade, BC has, as a result, had some of the lowest personal income tax rates in most income brackets in Canada. But that was then, and this is now. Because now there is a BC NDP government who has changed the rules, so to speak, that a revenue-neutral carbon tax has instead become an NDP tax grab. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we are now seeing the obvious. Let me quote a headline from the Vancouver Sun that occurred earlier this year, and I quote, "Latest figures show BC's carbon emissions continue to increase." The article goes on to point out that the latest data shows BC's carbon emissions at 63.3 million tons of carbon equivalent are an increase of 1.6% over the previous year. So to be clear, Mr. Speaker, that is an increase and not a decrease. But that is not the only place where the carbon tax is not working. You see, right next door is Washington State. Now, as we all know, the United States had no national carbon tax. In 2016, Washington State looked at a carbon tax, but it was voted down. So what happens when one of your largest trading partners, who is also one of your biggest competitors, or where most of them are located, does not have a carbon tax? Well, let's look at an example of the BC British Columbia cement industry as an example. In 2008, at the time the BC carbon tax was introduced, basically 100% of all cement used in British Columbia was manufactured in British Columbia. And why not? Concrete is not exactly a lightweight, inexpensive product to import and then transport from other jurisdictions. What happened when BC produced concrete started to become subject to a carbon tax in 2008, Mr. Speaker? That's a great question. It became more expensive. By 2014, BC produced concrete only accounted for roughly 65% of all concrete used in BC because cheaper concrete was being imported from jurisdictions with no carbon tax. That is a 35% loss of market share within your own market. As a result of this, the BC government is now providing financial subsidies to the BC concrete industry. They actually have a term for this now, and it's called carbon leakage. Here's how carbon leakage is defined in the BC NDP 2018 budget document, and I quote, "Industries that compete with industry in countries that may have low or no carbon price. If industry loses market share to more polluting competitors, known as carbon leakage, it affects our economy and does not reduce global greenhouse gas emissions," end quote. This is a flat-out admission that a carbon tax is not all it's made out to be, Mr. Speaker, because it creates carbon leakage. And why do you think, and I say carbon leakage, is found in this budget document? Because subsidies and exemptions cost everyday taxpayers money. You see, for the average hardworking Canadian family, there is no carbon tax exemption or relief for them. Costs for everyday items will skyrocket, taxes will rise, and life will simply become unaffordable for everyday Canadians. Instead, when this Prime Minister is confronted with the fact that carbon taxes have helped to create some of the highest gasoline and diesel prices in North America, he says, and I quote, "That's exactly what we want," end quote. Is it really? I can tell you it is not what my constituents are saying in Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola, when they fuel up at local gas stations. In fact, they are saying quite the opposite. I have places in my riding that are not accessible by public transport. Even private transport providers like Greyhound are abandoning some rural communities. Many of these same communities do not have access to renewable energy or even cleaner burning non-renewables like liquefied natural gas. These people get hit the hardest by a carbon tax. One gentleman actually showed me his natural gas bill from last month. Now, if you'd believe it, Mr. Speaker, with the latest carbon tax increase, he actually paid more in carbon taxes than he did in actual natural gas he used last month. Seriously, think about that. Paying more in a tax on a commodity than what the commodity actually costs. And this Prime Minister says that's exactly what he wants. What is more insulting is this Liberal government has an environment minister that likes to say pollution isn't free. And on this side of the House, we say, okay, tell us what it will cost Canadians. This transparent government, Liberal government, refuses to say, Mr. Speaker. The information is actually redacted. It is being hidden from Canadians who deserve to know. Basically, this Liberal government demands you pay this Liberal carbon tax, but they refuse to tell you how much you'll have to pay. Now, I am hopeful that the Office of the Information Commissioner, who has now launched an investigation to determine why the data about financial costs of a carbon tax per household is not being released to Canadians. We'll find the reason why. Last week, I asked my constituents why they thought this Liberal government was refusing to release this carbon tax information. Now, I can tell you the reason they shared with me do not inspire confidence in this Liberal government. In closing, we have a carbon tax that after 10 years in BC has still failed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have a carbon tax that has helped to create the most expensive gasoline prices in North America, and living costs continue to rise. Now, Mr. Speaker, we do have two problems here. First, we have a carbon tax that has proven that many industries cannot compete with countries that do not have a carbon tax. Now, despite this Prime Minister's insistence on his progressive trade agenda, it has been a total failure. And how often do we hear about carbon leakage, Mr. Speaker? We don't, because those who promote carbon taxes refuse to talk about carbon leakage because it's an acknowledgement that carbon taxes can harm your economy without reducing pollution. There is no mystery why investment in Canada has declined every year since this Liberal government was elected, because each year they have been in power, they have enacted policies that increase costs and make us less competitive as a country. Irresponsible governments sitting on massive amounts of carbon tax revenue love to throw that money around picking winners and losers. Now, I should add that the BC greenhouse growers have also secured BC carbon tax exemptions, not unlike some of Ontario's worst industrial polluters, who have also received extensions and exclusions from the Ontario cap and trade way of taxing carbon. Now, Mr. Speaker, we all know that more carbon tax increases the list of greenhouse gas emitters getting carbon leakage subsidies and relief will also continue to rise. And that leads to my second point, Mr. Speaker. We will have a carbon tax that penalizes hardworking Canadian families because they never get exemptions from paying the carbon tax. And we all know who pays for those subsidies and handouts, Mr. Speaker. It is those hardworking families who are increasingly struggling to get by because this government, this Liberal government, keeps downloading costs onto them. And Environment Canada itself expects the carbon tax to go even higher. The Liberals are refusing to tell Canadians what it will cost, but they are completely hiding that they won't stop there. They will just continue, Mr. Speaker, to increase carbon tax on Canadians. I mean, heck, when either the Prime Minister or the Environment Minister were asked about how much greenhouse gas emissions would be taken out of the environment by a Liberal carbon tax, we all know they won't answer. Just remember in BC, after a decade of carbon tax, greenhouse gas emissions just went up and not down. Now, the price of gasoline, the price to heat your home in Canada, the price to get groceries, to provide food for your family, and the price of everyday goods that Canadians rely on, Mr. Speaker, they will all go up under this Liberal carbon tax. We must stop increasing costs on Canadians with a failed carbon tax that we have already established is not working. That is why I will be voting in favor of this motion, Mr. Speaker. I believe that we need to start addressing the cost of living for Canadians, not making this country unaffordable to them to live here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Fleetwood, Port Kells.
Well, thank you, Speaker. I too come from British Columbia, and I have a bit of a different story. I can tell the honourable member that when the carbon tax was introduced in BC, I altered my travel patterns. I used transit a lot more in Metro Vancouver, which we could do, and I ended up ahead of the game. So when they ask, what's it going to cost the average Canadian? Well, I'm maybe not average, but I actually ended up with more money in my pocket because I did take advantage of the regime that was there. Now, of course, acknowledging that may have changed, it's still an issue that, that money is there for purposes of British Columbia. The ag sector was exempted in BC because that didn't drive up the price of food. But what I really wanted to ask the member, he quoted a figure that the emissions had gone up by 1 point something percent over the 10 years that the carbon tax has been in place. How can he explain that next to the fact that the BC economy, just in the last 5 years, has gone up 3.3%, 3.7%, 2.7%, 2.5%?
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to simply share with my fellow British Columbian that what I had said about 1.6% increase in emissions was year over year from 2014. So again, that's information that's publicly available. Now, when it comes to it, he actually highlights his own personal example, Mr. Speaker. And again, we live in different parts of the province, but I would say to the people that live in Coston, the people that live in Olalla, the people that live in Headley, many of them are seniors and moved there specifically to keep their bills down. And Mr. Speaker, when I get phone calls from those people asking the question how they'll be able to keep up with the costs that continue to rise, how do they get to Penticton Regional Hospital for services they need when it's becoming more and more expensive to either pay their ICBC bill or to pay for the carbon tax? Mr. Speaker, this man may know his own story, but he should really try to relate to the stories of thousands of people in my riding who have a much different experience of the carbon tax.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my honourable colleague. I want to just clarify something that's been bandied around in the House quite a bit lately, which is the high price of gasoline in Vancouver. Just to clarify that has had no relation whatsoever either to pipeline accessibility or to carbon taxes. The only refinery in the Lower Mainland used to be owned by Chevron. It was recently purchased by Parkland, and for the first quarter of this year, I'm sure he's aware that they were doing massive upgrades and renovations, so there was less locally refined gas available, more purchased from the U.S. That's the only reason that Vancouver now has such high gas prices. It is not related to the BC carbon tax.
For Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly appreciate this member's contribution for views regarding her constituents. I know she does a lot of town halls, as I do. But let's get serious. April 1st, we saw gas prices go up in BC specifically because the BC NDP raised the carbon tax from $30 a ton of greenhouse gas emissions to $35. And under this Liberal imposed regime, it will go up to $50 by 2022. So gas prices went up in April. It was specifically because of this. In fact, the Premier tried to say to the federal government, can you give us some tax relief for gasoline or some relief from gasoline in British Columbia? Mr. Speaker, what hypocrisy, because it's both of these two governments that have agreed to a schedule that will cost people in British Columbia more and more every year.
Questions and comments. Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, we know that according to the World Bank, 67 jurisdictions and counting around the planet now have a price on carbon. So my question to the member opposite is that why are Conservatives so keen to miss out on where the global economy is headed with respect to clean growth? Are they out of touch, or are they simply going to get on the right side of history in about a decade, the same way that it took them about a decade after the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage to change their official definition of marriage at a party convention?
Honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
There was so much going on in that question, Mr. Speaker, that it makes it laughable, but it's not laughable to people in British Columbia that are facing higher costs of living. And, Mr. Speaker, we are part of an integrated economy here. The member knows that NAFTA is up right now for renegotiation. We are integrated with the Americans. The Americans do not have a price on carbon, which will, again, as I said, that even the BC NDP government has said that carbon leakage is a growing concern. Why? paper and pulp mills, Mr. Speaker, will become less competitive at $50, and the NDP are starting to set the stage for increased subsidies. Mr. Speaker, Jean Tirole, who is a Nobel Prize economist, has said that carbon leakage exists, and it can actually have the worst of both worlds, where we have high carbon tax in one jurisdiction that forces a lower price of gas that gets consumed in the other. That is a real possibility for North America, and this member's out of touch if he thinks that that's not going to be part of it.